Just take a look at Jesus' life. Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry are plagued with interruptions. In fact, most of his ministry happened in the interruptions on his journey. Jesus was interrupted when he was traveling. He was going from Samaria to Jerusalem, and 10 lepers come running out toward Jesus. "Have mercy on us, teacher, have mercy on us and heal us." Jesus is stopped in his tracks. He's stopped on the journey and has to attend to these 10 lepers, these 10 people who are sick. They become the flat tire along the roadside of Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem. But he stops, and he does his best stuff there in that interruption. Jesus is interrupted while he's teaching. He's in the synagogue, and he's teaching, and I can only imagine as a preacher, Jesus has got a great sermon going. He's whooped up a great homiletical theory and approach to his sermon, and he's teaching people, and they're starting to be enlightened, and he thinks, wow, I'm really on fire. Not that I ever think those sort of things, but that happens every now and then. But right at that critical moment, when he's about to make that important crystallizing point, that takeaway point that's going to maybe change people's lives or allow them to live in a new way, what happens? There's a man who's possessed with demons who stands up in the synagogue and starts shouting at Jesus. "Jesus, we know who you are." Boy, nothing throws a preacher off more than that kind of interruption. A crying baby is nothing to a person who's possessed standing up in worship shouting at you. Besides, I used to say the only children that bothered me in worship when they were fussing were my own. And parents know that. Now, it's not someone else's fussy kid that bothered you. It's your own. You get a little stressed about that. That's why I became a pastor, so I didn't have to sit with my kids. Jesus is interrupted not by a fussy child. Fussy kids, we've got a nursery if things get too out of control, right? But what do you do with a person who's possessed with demons shouting at you in the middle of your sermon right when you're trying to make that crystallizing point? Well, Jesus stops what he's doing, and he attends to the man. He attends to the demons, and he casts the demons out of that man, and he brings healing to that man. Jesus even interrupted when he's at prayer. Even when he's at prayer. Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 35 and 36, say that while it was still dark, Jesus withdrew to a deserted place that he could pray, that he could be alone with God in heaven, and that he could connect with his Father. And then it says in verse 36 that Simon and some of the others, and here's the word that Mark uses, they hunted for Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried to get a quiet moment in your life, you're trying to have some prayer time, you're trying to connect with God, and the phone rings and it's work, and they need something of you, you feel like you're hunted. Samantha and Corey, you don't know interruptions yet. You're going to get interruptions. Alexandra she's going to hunt for you one day. You're going to think, boy, we are tired out from being parents. We are exhausted. We need a break. And maybe you're going to go away for a weekend and grandma's going to watch Alexandra for you, or great-grandma is, and you're going to think, wow, this is so special, and we're on our own. It's like a second honeymoon, and all of a sudden the phone's going to ring. You're having your Calgon moment. You're going to feel like Alexander's hunting for you. That's what Mark's Gospel says, chapter 1, verses 35 and 36, that Simon and the others hunted for Jesus. That's an interruption, isn't it? Today I shared with you 2 healing stories. Jesus was interrupted, wasn't he? Jesus was interrupted on his way to the home of Jairus, the synagogue leader's home, to heal his little girl. And while he's on his way, the gospel says that the crowds pressed in on Jesus. There were people sort of pushing in on him. They're curious onlookers. There are people who are really taken by this new religious healer and this religious teacher. And so they're crowding up close, almost as if they were in a crowd watching a parade, scrambling through the streets on their way to Jairus' home to heal Jairus' daughter, who was deathly ill. Now, Mark's gospel says that while they were going there, Jesus was interrupted. He was interrupted by a woman in the crowd who was also sick. She was hemorrhaging for 12 years, says Mark's gospel. 12 years internal bleeding. 12 years of going to the doctors, trying to get some health care, trying to get some healing for what was wrong with her inside. And nothing. She'd actually spent her last dime. She was broke, says Mark's gospel. She spent everything she had, but then she saw this miracle worker, this healer, Jesus. She'd heard about him, and now here he was in her presence, and she believed that if I just reach out, and if I just touch his cloak, his robe, his clothing, if I just touch it, something of his power will come into my life and will bring me healing. You know, when I was in the 3rd grade, there was this little girl. Actually, she was the tallest kid in the class, Sherry Smith. I had such a crush on her. She was the tallest, she was the prettiest, and she was the smartest kid in the class. Now, don't laugh, because I know that some of you have thought the same way maybe when you were in the 3rd grade. I believed if I could just touch her pencil, if I could write with her pencil, then maybe I might be as smart as Sherry. I told you not to laugh. No, you can laugh. That's fine. And I see some of you nodding your heads. There's this kind of sense that maybe with special people, if we touch their pencil, we might be just a little brighter ourselves. Well, here's a woman who recognized she was in the presence of not just a special person, she was in the presence of the Son of God. And she knew that it would be very real, that if she touched his cloak, that power would come into her and she would experience healing. What does Jesus do? He feels some of that power going out of him and into her, and he stops in the middle of the crowd. He stops and says, "Who touched me?" Now that's an odd thing. Jesus is on an emergency house call to the home of Jairus, a synagogue leader. First of all, a person with status. Jesus is on his way to the home of someone with status in that community, someone with power and privilege. And he's on his way to the home where there's somebody who's deathly ill. And Jesus stops. He's interrupted. And he stops in the middle of that interruption and says, "Who touched my coat?" Now you can imagine if you were one of the disciples, you might be saying, "Jesus, what are you thinking?" In fact, that's what the disciples did say. They said, "Jesus, we're in a crowd. Why would you stop now to try and figure out who touched you?" Certainly there's the religious laws of purity. Right? That woman really crossed a line, because we know that in the Jewish tradition, a woman who's hemorrhaging or experiencing menstruation is not only not supposed to be in the presence of a rabbi, a holy teacher, but certainly wouldn't dare to touch one. So they might have thought, well, Jesus is just trying to figure out who broke the law, but still, there's a little girl who's dying, Jesus. Let's get moving, man. But Jesus stops and says, Who touched me? If you can imagine, there's a big gathering in Public Square. Maybe it's this Thursday. You know, we're all gathered for the orchestra and the fireworks, but there's an ambulance that's got to get through the crowd. And as the ambulance is going through Public Square, through the crowd, trying to get to the place where there's somebody who's really in trouble, and somebody reaches out and touches the side of the ambulance as it goes through. Imagine the ambulance stopping. The driver parks the ambulance, gets out of the ambulance, comes out into the crowd and says, "Who touched the ambulance?" Don't you think the other paramedic in the passenger seat's going to say, "What are you thinking? What? Come on, we got business. There's an emergency. Let's get going." That's what the disciples were thinking when Jesus stopped to find out who touched him. But in the middle of it all, in that interruption, Jesus stops, finds out who it is. The gospel says that she revealed herself. She comes down, falls on her knees before Jesus and says, "It was me. I knew that if I just touched your cloak, I'd be okay." And Jesus says, "Woman, your faith has made you well. Go and live in the new life in God. Your faith has healed you."